I want to talk in this video about the relationship between act and rule utilitarianism. We've talked some about different kinds of consequentialism. Since utilitarianism is a specific form of consequentialism, there are also act and rule and, well, also character and motive and institutional versions of utilitarianism. So we want to think about some of those in the relationship to one another. And here I want to discuss the act and rule versions especially. Most people who have been utilitarians have been either act utilitarians or rule utilitarians. And there is a kind of standard set of arguments for each position. I don't want to go into them in detail here. I just want to say the overall consideration in favor of act utilitarianism is simply that it's what's closest to the consequences. We think about the consequences of actions, and then, yes, there's a sense in which rules and policies and motives and institutions and even entire civilizations can have consequences, but they all seem in some way built on the consequences of actions. And so you might say, in the end, it all comes down to the consequences of actions, doesn't it? That's where we begin, whatever we say about the relationship between those other considerations, all of which are important, and actions. It looks like actions are fundamental. So I think a lot of the arguments in favor of act utilitarianism really come down to that. The arguments in favor of rule utilitarianism tend to go the other way. They say, well, actually, I can't evaluate an action and its consequences or its tendencies toward consequences unless I know what the overall rules are. I have to understand something about its relationship to the rule. And when I think about actions, I'm not thinking about this or that particular action. I can do that after the fact because then the action is actually established. But beforehand, I'm thinking about a kind of action. I'm thinking about a tendency of an action. I'm thinking about something that might be fulfilled in all sorts of ways. I might think, should I contribute $100 to that charity? And I think about the effect of, well, that action. There's no one particular action there. There's an action of a certain kind. I might write a check. I might send them $100 in the mail. I might do a variety of other things. And so it looks as if that's a situation where many different actions are of that same kind. In fact, H.A. Pritchard had said earlier, this in the 20th century, about 100 years ago, almost exactly now, that oughts and duties are never really directed toward particular actions. They're directed toward kinds of actions. And for that reason precisely, there are all sorts of ways of fulfilling any kind of obligation that count as different particular actions, but actions of the same kind with respect to our moral duties. So the rule utilitarian says, look, we're always really making decisions between kinds, and that is to say, it's not really consequences of individual actions we focus on. Instead, it's consequences of kinds of action. But when I think about that, I'm in effect thinking about the consequences of a rule for action. And so I'm always evaluating a particular act in the context of, and usually by means of, thinking about a rule. Well, however that debate may go, I want to take a look at the position that John Stuart Mill takes on this question, because I think it's interesting. It reflects the views very strongly of Maimonides, who faced a similar kind of question in medieval philosophy. And it reflects, I think, an intriguing perspective and an intriguing distinction that often gets overlooked. A distinction between the theoretical answer to a question and a practical answer. Let me give you an example. Suppose I am thinking about acids and bases in chemistry, and I want to be able to discern what is an acid, what's a base, and say something about what it is to be an acid and what it is to be a base. When I do that, I might have in mind, well, a practical way of telling. So if I say, well, look, here are a number of different compounds here, and I've been told some of these are acids, some are bases, some aren't either one, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, which ones are which. Somebody might say, oh, well, here, use this litmus paper, or here's some phenolphthalein, try this, and that will be a good indicator. It's a good practical test. Or here's a little pH kit, test the pH on this. That's a nice way of telling what the pH is, and so what is an acid and what is a base among my collection. Nice practical test. But of course, it doesn't tell me what an acid or a base really is. It doesn't tell me what makes those things acids and these things bases. If I want to know that, I have to know something about hydrogen ions, hydroxide ions. I have to know something about ionization so that I can say, aha, these are acids, which means they have the form H plus and then something, right? And these have an OH and so on. And in doing that, what I'm really doing is giving you an underlying explanation, theoretically, of what makes these things what they are. But on the other hand, when I do that, you might say, look, that's not much of a practical test. I say, how do I tell which ones are which? And you say, well, look for the hydrogen ions. So, well, how do I do that? That doesn't help me. So the same thing can arise in ethics. If I'm thinking what makes a right action right, what makes a wrong action wrong, that's a theoretical question that may be quite different and may have a different answer from the question, how practically do I tell right from wrong? Similarly, if I'm interested in what's good and bad, I might say, well, here's a good practical test. But if you really want to know what makes those that pass the test good and those that fail the test bad, that's a different question and happens at a different level. The reason I go into this difference between a practical test for something and the theoretical explanation of it, something closely connected actually to this issue that Locke raises of real versus nominal essences, then what I'm really doing is saying, look, sometimes I have to have different theories for those two things. And I think in the end, that's Mill's position. When he's thinking about different kinds of utilitarianism, he says one is the right theoretical answer, one's the right practical test. And so let's take a look at the details. If we think about this contrast between act and rule utilitarianism, we might think, well, how do we even begin to think about such a question? I want to consider a simple objection to utilitarianism that Mill begins by considering in that section of his book, Utilitarianism. He says, some people object to utilitarianism on grounds of time. They say, wait, you're saying I have to calculate pleasures and pains before I can act? Actually, you've explained the moral calculus to me. That's really complicated. I get that I should do something like that when I'm dealing with very complicated financial decisions. Let's say a company is thinking about building a new factory. Yeah, they should do that. But I'm trying to decide what to have for dinner. You want me to do that? I'm never going to have dinner. I'm going to spend all my time calculating. Aren't we going to end up spending most of our lives just doing these calculations? And actually, if we start reflecting on that and saying, well, calculating is itself an action, right? I mean, if I'm supposed to do that, shouldn't I calculate about whether or not to calculate? But hold on, then I'd have to calculate about whether or not to calculate about whether or not to calculate, and so on and so forth, the infinite regress. Eventually I have to stop, right? So hold on a second. I don't know how to tell what to do here. I'm not sure what I can say about all of this. And don't tell me, well, just stop at one level. Yes, calculate about things, but don't calculate about whether or not to calculate. Because presumably if I'm to adopt that policy, I have to calculate about it, but I should calculate about that if and only if I shouldn't. So I'm trapped in paradoxes here. Anyway, yes, Mill doesn't consider all those little logical infinite regress and weird circularity and possible self-referential fallacy objections. But there is a real practical question here. How can we tell when we've calculated enough? Presumably we shouldn't spend most of our lives calculating, and even the utilitarian would tell us that. However, how do we know when we can stop calculating, when we've calculated enough? It's a real issue. Think about a common institutional solution to problems. You appoint a committee to study the problem. But then, well, how long should that committee deliberate? Often it feels like in government nothing ever gets done. You appoint a committee, and they appoint a subcommittee to study this aspect of the question, and that subcommittee to this, and nothing ever happens. No decisions are ever made. That kind of thing can go on. I've served on many university and college committees. I've even served on the committee on committees. Yeah, sometimes it can feel like, yes, we spend all of our time in committee meetings deliberating and nothing ever actually happens. So there really is a danger here. This is a practical problem, not just a theoretical problem. Well, Mill considers this, and he says, look, I consider this a silly objection. He says, the principle of utility is something that justifies our actions, but it doesn't have to be our motivation. I am not telling you every time you have to act because you've done a calculation and come to this conclusion. Of course not. You think about what you want to have for dinner, you don't have to sit down and calculate, just have what you want. It doesn't have to be your motivation that you think, oh, it'll be for the benefit of the entire community if I do this. And he says, so, ordinarily we don't calculate. It's as if you're telling the sailor who goes to sea, he has to calculate all of the nautical tables. Or the Christian who is trying to make a decision, well, you better read the entire Bible here before you make the decision. He says, look, we don't do that. We go on the basis of practical rules. We apply the principle of utility, or he says, look, for that matter, any other moral theory, or any other theory of any kind at all, even a navigational theory, we apply it by using secondary principles. We've already calculated lots of things. Not just we as individuals, but the human race has already come to a whole bunch of conclusions about navigation, about how to live a good life, about what a good government or a good legal system is. And he says, we just apply those common sense moral rules, or those well-established traditional rules that have been developed by people over centuries. What justifies those rules? Well, in the end, utility. It's good to follow those rules. So here it looks like, and indeed some people argue, Mill is actually in the end a rule utilitarian, because he's saying, yeah, you don't have to judge case by case and calculate case by case. We go on the basis of good rules and we trust other people's previous calculations about those. When do we appeal to the principle of utility? Only when those secondary principles, only when those common sense moral rules come into conflict. So here's a picture of how we go about making decisions, according to Mill. We typically don't do it by actually sitting down and doing the moral calculus. Instead, we follow common sense moral rules. Sometimes they're common sense in the sense that they're the broad moral rules that we all learn as children and that we all operate with. Sometimes they're more specific moral rules about the responsibilities that go with the specific profession, the obligations of a professor, or the obligations of an attorney, or of a judge, or of a medical doctor, etc., etc. And so sometimes it's something unique to a particular profession. Sometimes it may be something else, a set of religious obligations. But whatever it is, it's something we learn from another source. Our motivation may be another source. But nevertheless, we justify those rules on the basis of their effects. We say these are rules that have good consequences. The history of humanity has more or less shown that. And then we act according to those rules. They can be our motivation. Or really, he says, it doesn't matter in a certain sense what your motivation is. If you do a good thing, I'm going to be happy. I don't care why you did it. And so in the end, he's going to say, look, what matters is consequences, and follow the good rules who humanity is judged to have good consequences. Now, sometimes those rules are going to come into conflict, and then you should sit down and calculate. So the principle of utility is going to play two roles. It's going to justify these secondary principles, these common sense rules. Those are going to serve as your practical test of morality. They're something like your litmus paper. Go by the common sense rules. And what does utility do? Well, it in part justifies those. But you don't have to do those calculations yourself. Somebody says, hey, do you think it's good to have a law against murder? You don't have to say, well, I don't know. Let me sit down and do a complex calculation. You can say, yeah, look, it's okay, right? It's not good for people to kill other people. It obviously produces a lot of unhappiness, wipes out a lot of happiness. A, it's not a complicated calculation, really, but B, we've had the entire history of the human race to figure this one out. But secondly, the principle of utility resolves conflicts between them. There is something that looks like a conflict between principles. Thou shalt not steal, and honor thy father and thy mother. That's a case where it looks like, well, these are both good moral rules, both found there in the Ten Commandments, and it looks like in this case where, hey, my father is stealing something. This is rather like Confucius's case of the father stealing the sheep. You might say, look, there is the familial obligation, but then there's also the wrongness of stealing and the obligation to do something about that. And so what do I do in that kind of case? Those kinds of conflicts can happen all the time. And in a sense, the more roles you take on in society, the more those conflicts are going to happen for you. Some people say, well, here's the solution. Stay out of those conflict situations. First of all, we can't always do that. But secondly, that really means, look, keep yourself and don't do much. And I think that's not the right answer either. The more involved you get in all sorts of things, the more you're going to face conflicts. Here's a list of secondary principles that W.D. Ross, in his book, The Right and the Good, proposed. He said, I don't argue that these are comprehensive, but I do think others that you might think of generally reduce to these. So what are these principles? They're very simple. Keep your promises. Correct your mistakes. show gratitude for kindnesses, promote justice, help others, improve yourself, don't harm others. He says those are the basic rules. You might think even some of those are duplicates, like isn't don't harm others something that follows from help others? He says not really. I mean, it's much worse to harm other people than to just fail to help them. So really he thinks those are 7 basic rules of morality. Maybe there are others that don't reduce to them. He's open to that. But anyway, that's his list of secondary principles. In each case, Mill would say, well, they're good principles, and here's why. Because they do promote happiness. Keep your promises. It's important to have a high-trust society. We're all going to benefit from that. It's not only that failing to keep a promise is going to hurt somebody you don't keep the promise to, it's going to, in general, make people trust other people less. That's a bad thing. What about making amends? Well, if there are all these uncorrected injustices sitting around, people are going to get angry, they're going to get resentful, vengeful. There are going to be bad effects to that. Not only the effect of that uncorrected injustice, for example, but also there are going to be various secondary and tertiary kinds of effects that are going to be negative. There are going to be problems. Don't hurt other people? Well, it's obvious. Going around hurting other people has a negative effect on happiness. Help other people? That has a positive effect on happiness, and so on. So John Stuart Mill would look and say, yeah, of course, the principle of utility justifies all of those rules. All of those are things that make perfect sense if we say our job is to promote the happiness of the community. Can they come into conflict? Well, sure. Now, every one of them, Mill would say, holds, but they hold cateris paribus, to use the phrase that philosophers are fond of. That is to say, they hold all other things being equal. They hold, given that no other moral considerations are intervening. But of course, they might intervene. The idea of honoring your father and mother might be a good moral rule. It holds all other things being equal. But what if your parents do something monstrous? Then you may have to say, I can't honor them anymore. I do have to report my father for stealing, well, maybe not stealing cable or even stealing a sheep, but maybe if the theft is big enough, then yes, I do. Or there might be other kinds of conflicts that arise as well, where I say even a good rule like don't hurt people. There might be occasions where I really do have to hurt people. Maybe I have to, for some other reason, punish them. Maybe I'm in the context of a war, and yes, it's my job as a soldier to hurt people, but I'm doing it for a greater good. In all of those cases, you might say, these are principles that hold, they're true, but they can come into conflict with other moral considerations, and when that happens, there can be exceptions to those rules. So that sort of thing can go on. We can have a rule that's a good rule, but there can be cases where it's better to set the rule aside. So what do we do when there's this kind of conflict? When we've got a conflict or a seeming exception to a rule? What do we do when we've got 2 different prima facie duties, 2 of these secondary principles that are telling us opposite things? Well, Mill says, I've got an advantage. And remember Bentham's point. One of his great arguments for the principle of utility is, I have an answer to that question, and most other moral theories don't. What's my answer? Calculate. Do the moral calculus. Bentham says, to the extent that you approximate rationality and morality, you're doing the moral calculus. Mill says that's too strong. But at least when you're in this kind of conflict situation, that's what you do. You calculate. So Lisa, calculate. Try to figure out what to do and what's going to be best in this situation. You face a circumstance where it looks like hurting somebody may be worth it in the long run, or like there's too much to be sacrificed if you really help that person who does need help. Well, then you have to calculate. You have to say, what are the effects on each side? And you have to decide what in this case is better. So in short, one thing you don't do is decide in general in these cases, this rule always takes precedence over this rule. Not always. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You have to look at it case by case and do some calculations. So you have to say in the end, what has better consequences? W.D. Ross considers that and he says, I don't like that. I want to ask a different question. Which is more of a duty? For Mill, unless that means which has better effects, he's going to say, I don't know how to tell what's more of a duty. Is it a greater duty to report a theft or a greater duty to honor my parents? I don't know. I mean, I don't think there is maybe any general way of ranking those. I don't know what is more of a duty. But when I look at the effects, I may get an easy conclusion. Dad's stealing cable, it may be better to look the other way. On the other hand, Dad just pulled off a theft of these bearer bonds from Nakatomi Tower. Maybe I should do something about that. Anyway, those issues have to be faced case by case, Mill says, and on the basis of consequences. Well, let's go back to that distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. The act utilitarian, like Bentham says, an act is right if it maximizes good, or if it produces at least enough good, if it tends to contribute to the happiness of the community. And so we're judging there an individual action by the moral calculus, by the principle of utility in terms of its consequences. In rule utilitarianism, like what we find in Berkeley, an act is right if it accords with the rules that maximize good or produce enough good, or in general tend to promote the happiness of the community. There we're judging the action typically by the rule, and then the rule by utility. Well, when do these disagree? We've talked about that a little. They disagree when a rule conflicts with utility in this particular case. When in this particular case, it's really better to set the rule aside. So what do we do about a case like that? What do we do about a case where we can do better by breaking a good rule? I talked in another video about some trivial examples of this, but when we think about these kinds of conflicts, we realize there can be very serious examples of these conflicts as well. And in some situations, I may actually have the same rule seemingly coming into conflict with itself. Maybe I have to end up harming this person or this person, and I have to choose between those two harms. Or maybe I'd like to help that person, but I can only do it at the cost of hurting that other person. Do I make that trade-off? Well, sometimes you might say, look, whichever way I go on that question, I'm breaking a good rule. So sometimes I can do better by breaking a good rule. But what should I do? Here is Maimonides' advice. He says, don't break it. Why? One, rules are essential to moral thought. When we think about what to do, we're thinking fundamentally about kinds of action. We're thinking about rules for action. And so, look, you have to respect rules. You have to think primarily in terms of rules. You are not going to be in a position to know for sure this is an exception case where you do better by breaking the rule. You're always thinking about a rule anyway. And so when you do this, you're going to face a horrible temptation. You're going to be tempted to break the rules for your own advantage. And so you're usually going to go wrong. The result of this is going to be moral chaos. Everybody setting these rules aside, and as it says in the last line of the book of Judges of the Old Testament, everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. That is not a view in the perspective of the author of the book of Judges of some kind of ideal utopia. It is moral chaos. It is a terrible situation where everybody's doing what they happen to think is right, and most of them are going wrong. Most of them are making mistakes and acting selfishly. So Maimonides says, look, I know you might think in this case you do better by breaking the rule, but you're likely to be wrong, and the result of everybody going around breaking rules when they feel like it and think they're justified is moral chaos. Don't do it. Of course, there still could be situations where in the end these two rules come into conflict in such a way that you have to break one or the other. But look, you want to minimize your exception making. You want to minimize your breaking of rules. Well, people have asked, is Mill, in the end, an act utilitarian or a rule utilitarian? His greatest happiness principle speaks of acts, but he stresses secondary principles. So he says they're really how we justify actions. Those are our typical motivations. So which way does he go? It's part of a broader question. Remember, we were talking about the general distinction among kinds of consequentialism. And we considered that, and we said, well, we might take all sorts of things that are involved in decision-making as basic. And in particular, any consequentialist is going to focus on the consequences of action, any utilitarian on the consequences in the form of happiness and effects on happiness for action. But then we have a number of decisions to make. Well, the act utilitarian says we focus on actions. Here we're talking, of course, about the consequences of actions, and that's the thing we really take as our starting point. Everything else gets defined in terms of the consequences of actions. But the rule utilitarian says no, it's more at this level, at the level of rules or policy or kinds of action that we're really focusing. We think about the consequences of kinds. We think about the consequences of rules or of policies. And then we judge actions in terms of being of certain kind. We say, yeah, that action was wrong because it was a murder, right? And when we say that, we're not saying, well, look, in this particular case, terrible things happened. They may be relevant too. But primarily we say that action was wrong because it was a murder. In short, it was a kind of action, and that kind of action is wrong. And that kind of action has terrible consequences. So the rule utilitarian is saying we judge acts by appeal to the rules or the kinds, and we talk about the kinds in terms of their consequences. For the act utilitarian, it's the reverse way. Why is this a good rule? And why do we come to that conclusion about the kind of action? Because in general, acts of that kind have good or bad consequences. So there is a very direct way of seeing, you might say, how this goes here. The one thinker is saying, look, here's the way the rules are. We judge these things in terms of acts and those in terms of the consequences. But the other says, no, it's not like that. Instead, this is primary. We think primarily about the consequences of kinds of action, and then we judge individual actions as being of a certain kind, as exhibiting a certain rule. So there really is a difference here. Which is Mill's picture? I've said it's something like this. We've got the principle of utility that is justifying the secondary principles, the rules, and then we judge acts in terms of that most often. Well, wow, that makes it look like he's a rule utilitarian. We're judging the act according to the rule, and the rule is justified by utility. That looks like that rule utilitarian pattern. So, is it the case that in the end, Mill's theory is very different from Bentham's theory? It's not really an act utilitarian theory at all, despite the language he uses initially. Does it turn out that in the end it's a rule utilitarian theory? Well, it's a good question to raise, and I don't think the answer is obvious by any means. John Venn, the guy who invented Venn diagrams and a prominent British mathematician at the time, wrote a letter to John Stuart Mill and said, I've read your book, Utilitarianism, marvelous, but I don't understand it, okay? He says, I don't understand whether this book is arguing in favor of, well, he didn't use these terms, but basically act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism. Are you saying that we should judge actions by the principle of utility, by their consequences? Or are you saying we should judge actions by rules and judge those rules by their consequences? That's rule utilitarianism. Well, Mill responds, and he responds with a 2-page letter that is rarely read, I think surprisingly, because he makes this issue very clear there. He says, in the end, what makes a right action right is its contribution to happiness. Or at the very least, we could say its tendency to contribute to happiness if we try to abstract from moral luck. So in short, he says, look, really theoretically, I'm an act utilitarian. I think we start by evaluating the consequences of action. That is fundamental. Everything else is really defined in terms of that. But then Mill explains why actually that is not the best practical test. He agrees with Maimonides. He says, I think it's true, however, that if we break a rule because we think in this case we're going to get more utility out of breaking the rule, we're usually going to go wrong. My official theory says what we do in such a case is we perform the calculation. We use the principle of utility, we apply. And if we did that always, and always did that correctly, then actually it would be fine. But that's not what happens. Usually, we're going to either neglect to do the calculation. We're thinking, yeah, I know this is in general wrong to break a promise, but in this case, boy, I'm a lot better off if I break that promise. And I don't think it causes that much harm, so I'm going to break it. We didn't really sit down and do a serious calculation there. We did a kind of, a little quick mental, am I really hurting anybody else badly by doing this? Not that badly. Okay, I'll do it. He says, first of all, we're usually going to go wrong. We're either not going to calculate at all, or we're going to do a crappy calculation. We're going to come up with the wrong answer. So he agrees with Maimonides that if we break that rule, usually we're breaking it at the wrong time, in the wrong way, the wrong place, and so on. It is better to obey the rule. So in short, Mill is saying, act utilitarianism is theoretically correct. I am an act utilitarian. Really, what makes a right action right is its tendency to promote happiness. I stand by my initial statement of the principle of utility. It is the right theoretical answer. But if you want to know the practical test, the little thing to have in your pocket to tell me, what do I do here? Actually, it's better to have Rule Utilitarianism as your pocket guide. It says, follow the rules that in general are the best rules. And so it's going to say, establish for yourself or trust other people to establish for your society or your profession or whatever it is, a set of rules, a set of principles, these secondary principles to live by, and live by those. Go by those, okay? That's the best practical test. Resort to the principle of utility and trying to act like a utilitarian in the act utilitarian sense only when things break down and two rules come into conflict. Don't just think, hey, I think there's an exception in this case. Say, wait, now I've got two weighty obligations because these two rules really do come into conflict. Now I have to calculate, but then really do the calculation. And so his point is, look, I'm telling you that in the end, the act utilitarian, in fact, that idea, look, when they come into conflict, do the calculation. That's his way of saying, in the end, it's act utilitarianism that really explains what you ought to do, what's better than what. But the rule utilitarian gives you the better practical guide. If you really try to do the moral calculus all the time and try to act like an act utilitarian, you're going to mess up and not do as well from a moral point of view in the end as the person who starts out being a rule utilitarian. So he's saying, think like an act utilitarian, act like a rule utilitarian.